6 guns aimed at his cabin, 4 women behind him. 1 child called him Papa. And Thaddeus Cain picked up the rifle he swore he'd never touch again. They said Thaddeus Cain died 15 years ago, when the fever took his wife and daughter and left him with nothing but silence and scorched land. But this morning, a blood-streaked little girl looked up at him and called him Papa, and behind her stood 3 ragged women, dragging their broken bodies out of the shadows. That was the moment he realized solitude wasn't safety. It was a trap. Behind them, killers were coming. In front of him, the rifle he swore he'd never raise again. And in the space between, the only question worth living for: would he protect them this time, or bury another child beneath the ashes of his past? Thaddeus Cain had long since stopped counting the days since his wife and daughter had fallen sick in the cruel grip of fever. For 15 unbroken years, he had dwelt alone on the sun-bleached expanse of his Arizona borderland ranch, a place scorched by relentless drought, and whispered tales of the mad Cain who once killed a doctor with his bare hands. The tumbleweed-choked road that led to his homestead bore no cart tracks save his own, and the wind-carved mesas beyond his fence stood sentinel like silent judges, their reddish faces reflecting every sunrise and sunset in shades of doom. His solitary silhouette, trudging across the cracked earth each morning, was as much a fixture of the landscape as the skeletal mesquite trees clawing at the sky. They said his grief had driven him insane. They said he'd slit the throat of a man in a furious embrace of hate. Whether any of it was true mattered little now, for rumor had grown into legend, and legend had become fact among the townsfolk of Silverbank. Each dawn he would pour a cup of dark, steaming coffee into a chipped tin mug and trace the name Ellie etched on a silver locket. He would press the locket to his chest and feel the cold imprint of memory. Ellie's laughter bubbling through the corrals, her tiny hand slipping into his as she chased a butterfly across the garden. Mary's gentle smile as she whispered, "He'll help you, Thad," on the morning she'd collapsed, though the doctor had refused to treat her without payment he could not afford. The mules brayed impatiently nearby, but he hardly heard them. In that moment, time was measured in the distance between his daughter's first breath and his first scream when he found her body lifeless on the floor. He had thrown the doctor across the parlor in a frenzy of rage, blood, and panic mixing hot in his veins. After that night, nobody dared approach the Cain place. No merchant wagon rolled onto his dusty doorstep. No traveling preacher dared call him friend or sinner. He was as untouchable as the vultures circling overhead. By midday, heat shimmered across the flatlands, turning dust into a copper haze that clung to skin and clothing. Thaddeus mended fences with gloved hands, his broad shoulders taut with muscle, born of years under sun and wind. But his eyes gray, distant, always scanned the horizon. He'd learned to read the land like scripture. A sudden breeze off the western mesa might mean thunderstorm miles away. A swirl of dust rising beyond the ridgeline could herald bandits or worse. He kept his shotgun stacked by the door, and the old Colt Peacemaker his father had carried in the 60s schooled under his mattress each night. When the sun hung low and the cattle's lowing grew faint, he sat on the broad front porch, his boots propped on the rail, lost in memories he could neither escape nor embrace. On one such evening, when the sky was a furnace of red-orange, and the cicadas droned like ancient engines winding down, Thaddeus noticed movement at the edge of his property. At first he thought it might be a stray cow, or a coyote bold enough to wander near water troughs. But as the figures drew closer, 4 small forms staggered into view, their clothes ragged and dust-caked. Behind them shuffled 3 women, each bearing the look of people who had seen worse than death and had no room left for hope. The last rays of sunlight caught something on one woman's skirt, a dark stain that might have been earth or mud or the dried blood. He sat up, every muscle in his chest coiling like a spring. The women paused some 20 yards from his porch, exchanging glances that spoke of fear and desperation. They did not call out. One by one, they knelt in the dirt, shielding the children behind them, as though auditioning for the worst of men. Then, with careful steps, they rose and approached. The air grew still, as if the desert itself paused to witness their arrival. The first woman, tall, straight-backed, bowed her head. The second looked up. Her eyes rimmed red, and the third clutched her skirt, where the stain darkened the coarse fabric. Their voices, when they came, were soft, hushed, almost ashamed. They did not ask for food or coin. They begged for shelter, for sanctuary, for deliverance from nameless terror. Thaddeus held his breath, his heart stilled by the sound of those small, trembling voices. Then the littlest child, a girl no older than 6, wrenched from her mother's skirt, appeared at the porch's edge and looked up at Thaddeus with eyes that were too old for a child's. A single strand of tawny hair, flecked with red dust, fell across her forehead. He expected tears, a plea for mercy, anything typical. Instead, her voice, clear and quiet, spoke one word, Papa. It was a word he had not heard in over a decade, no half a lifetime. That single syllable detonated inside his chest, shattering his composure. Papa was not what any stranger would call him. It was what his daughter Ellie had called him before she died. Her tiny arms wrapped around his neck as they picnicked under a cottonwood tree. And it was Ellie's name that spilled from the child's lips. Not Papa, but Ellie. The girl's innocent croon, naming him as her father's father, cracked open the door to a world he had sealed away with barbed wire and bitter silence. He felt the stiff ache in his joints loosen, and for the first time in years, hope flickered a candle, guttering in a storm. He rose from the rail, the boards creaking under his weight, and walked to the edge of the porch. The women froze, bracing themselves, as though his next move would be their undoing. He stood silent for a breathless moment, the red sky casting his shadow long across the dirt. The world held its breath. The tumbleweeds halted their tumbling. "Come inside," he said, his voice low, gravelly from disuse. He stepped aside and gestured with a nod. The tall woman glanced back at her companions, then took the girl's hand. The small girl's grip was shockingly strong. Her fingers clamped around the woman's skirt, as if it were the only tether left in the world. The group rose slowly and filed onto the porch, the boards groaning under their weight. Thaddeus watched them with a curious mixture of suspicion and relief. No one spoke. Only the desert wind rustled along the horizon, carrying the faint whisper of some riotous storm beyond the mesas. Inside the cabin was dim. The late afternoon light filtered through dusty windows, painting the rough-hewn walls in bronze tones. 6 chairs surrounded a scarred wooden table, and a kerosene lamp sat unlit on its surface. Thaddeus led them to seats around the table, then crossed to the corner where a faded oilcloth sack held his last sack of flour. He nodded toward a tin cup and served lukewarm water. The women drank with swift gulps as the children watched their faces pale and drawn. He studied the littlest girl, whose wide eyes still clung to something he could not name recognition, perhaps, or a hope he did not dare acknowledge. The bloodstain on the woman's dress glinted in the fading light, dark as spilled time. Thaddeus sensed that they were not ordinary fugitives. They were running from something monstrous. He listened as their ragged breaths settled into a hush. The child whispered again, Ellie, and the name crashed through him like lightning. He could have closed the door then. He could have told them to leave, to vanish into the red dusk before he reclaimed his solitude. But when he looked at the child, he saw not a stranger's face, but his own daughter's innocence reborn. He remembered vows of protection he had uttered to Mary on her deathbed, a promise he thought had died with them. He realized in that moment that protection did not end with blood, nor did love with the last breath of a child. It was as enduring as the desert itself, harsh and unforgiving, yet capable of surprising tenderness. He struck a match and lit the lamp. The flickering flame threw dancing shadows on the walls, and the room seemed to steady itself around the new warmth. He did not yet know who pursued them, nor how far the danger extended. He did not know whether the child was truly his daughter, or how to reach the dark place in her heart that mirrored his own. But as the sun slipped below the mesa and night closed in, Thaddeus Cain, formerly a man broken by grief, felt the familiar stirrings of purpose. The silence between them grew charged, pregnant with questions, and fraught with unspoken fears. And in that sweat-slick moment, as the desert's hush enveloped the cabin, he made his choice. They would stay. Outside, a coyote's cry rose and fell. The wind rattled the shutters. Tomorrow, he would face the world beyond his fence. Tomorrow, he would discover what horrors trailed these women and children. Tonight, however, he would sit with them by lamplight, face his ghosts, and find that his heart was no longer empty, but beginning to beat once more. And somewhere in the red dusk, a new story was unfolding, one that would bind him irrevocably to the ragged strangers who had called him Papa. Thaddeus Cain's cabin lay nestled against a low sandstone bluff, its unpainted boards bleached by 5 long years of sun and wind. Beyond the scatter of mesquite and creosote, a 1/4 mile of scrub gave way to the Copper Gulch Road, which led past Silverbank's dusty storefronts into scrub country, where the land fell away toward Mexico. It was just past sunset when 3 shadows slipped from the tumbleweeds and converged at the edge of the gulch Calla, Miriam, and June, each cloaked in the ragged dregs of their dignity. Calla moved with the calm precision of a cavalry veteran who'd learned that hesitation meant vulnerability. Miriam stalked beside her, eyes narrow and glinting with bitterness, and June, wounded and pale as ghostlight, leaned heavily against Calla's arm, her shawl pressed to a darkening stain on her hip. Overhead, embering clouds chased daylight into dusk, while a fiery moon rose behind the mesas. The women paused where the trail dipped to the wash, listening for the baying of tracking dogs or the snap of a twig under boot. All they heard at first was the wind rustling dried leaves and the faint thrum of cicadas in the cholla. 2 nights earlier, in Silverbank's hidden debt servitude station, the 3 had been bound in chains and forced into indenture under Sheriff Lucas Hale's watchful eye. The station was little more than an abandoned stagecoach relay. Its walls lined with rough bunks, and its bunkhouse flanked by a low enclosure of barbed wire. Under cover of night, they had worked in shifts hauling sandstone blocks and loading freight crates from McKinley Ranch, while overheard screams from a locked private room told of women who had refused the manager's pleasures being beaten until they bled. Calla, who once cooked for the cavalry at Fort Bliss, had quietly watched the cruelty and stored it away, Miriam, whose husband had died in the mines, only to see her sold as collateral, wore anger like armor. June, a gentle soul with a voice as soft as dove-wing, had delighted in humming hymns to the other workers until yesterday, when she was dragged screaming into the manager's chamber and emerged limping, blood seeping between her legs. It was June who unleashed them all, hurling a chipped crock at the overseer's head. In that instant, the cage doors flew open and a dozen rifle barrels pointed their way. But in the chaos, the three ran clutching each other's skirts as they hurtled toward freedom. They seized a freight wagon, idling at the station's corral. The horses fresh-shod, but restless, and pressed themselves behind stacked sacks of grain as Hale's deputies yelled orders and fired shots. A hail of bullets ricocheted off the wagon's wooden flank. Miriam shouted for June to hold still as Calla smacked the reefer's rough side until the driver, a terrified freight handler, whipped the geldings into motion. The horses bolted down the Copper Gulch Road at a rattling gallop, carrying them away from the station and into the desert night. June cried out when a chunk of board punctured her thigh. Miriam clutched her bleeding leg, tears coursing down her cheeks. Calla knelt in the hayloft and ripped a strip from her blouse, binding June's wound with urgent hands. The wagon jolted and pitched through washouts and rocky ford. Each jolt pressed June's wound into fire. Calla whispered fierce reassurances, her voice low and resolute, while Miriam scanned the darkness for starlight that might guide them to Thaddeus Cain's homestead, the only place rumored to offer shelter without question. Meanwhile, at Sheriff Hale's modest office in Silverbank, the lawman stood framed by a window overlooking the main drag. Under a lamp's glow, he unfolded a worn map marked with circles of outlying settlements and the stations of the smuggling ring he controlled. His office smelled of leather and stale tobacco. A rack of Winchester rifles leaned behind his desk, reminders of both his authority and the lengths he would go to protect his enterprise. Hale's jaw was square, his eyes ice blue. When a breathless deputy burst in to report the escape, Hale merely laid down his bolt-action carbine and clicked his tongue. "They won't get far," he said, his calm voice predatory. "Fetch every man with a horse, seal the gulch, leave no tracks unscanned." He donned his hat, the brim dipping low over brows that rarely arched in surprise. "And bring back the little one alive. The rest can bleed." Beneath his uniform, Hale bore the scars of the frontier, 2 faint puckers on his left cheek where a knife had slipped during a cattle drive years ago. Those scars were testament to the violence he'd endured and inflicted, and they set the tone for every man under his command. Back on the dusty trail, the wagon lurched to a stop at a low rise above a parched arroyo, the horses' whinnied nostrils flaring in the chill night air. Calla peered over the side and spied a wisp of dust curling behind them, not far off, but enough of a head start. "We can't outrun them on this rough track," she muttered. Miriam dropped 2 of the sacks to the ground and helped June steady herself as the driver slid down face white with fear. With no time to argue, Calla grabbed the reins and told the driver to circle back to Silverbank, to tell whoever asked that 3 women and a child had perished in the gulch, that no rescue was possible. The man whose hands shook nodded and urged the horses away under a ragged moon. As the wagon's wheels faded, Calla turned to Miriam and June. "Cain's place is our only hope," she said. "If his doors stay closed, we'll die here before sunrise." Then, yielding to June's pain, Calla braced her friend's arm across her shoulder and began to lead her through the scrub toward the crescent of distant lights betraying the homestead's lanterns. Thaddeus Cain, meanwhile, sat hunched by the hearth inside his dim cabin, cleaning an oil-stained handkerchief with water from a chipped basin. The kerosene lamp wavered its flame, throwing the rough-hewn walls into restless relief. He'd heard horses 2 nights in a row, but had dismissed them as passing ranch hands or stray traders. Tonight, however, the hoofbeats had been too rhythmic, too purposeful, grinding over the gravel like a slow drum. His broad shoulders twitched at each echo. Even 15 years of solitude could not dull the sentry's instinct passed down from soldier to son. Rising, he laid aside the handkerchief and retrieved the lantern. In silence, he opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The desert air held the faint tang of creosote and distant rain, though no cloud drifted above. He waited, listening fingers curling around the lantern's metal handle. Calla guided June through a washed-out trail sloping toward the bluff. A thin layer of sand muffled their footsteps, but Calla knew they could not hide forever. Miriam paused to survey the land with narrowed eyes. "His cabin sits 7 miles that way," she whispered, pointing toward a single bright star that hovered over a plateau. "It's as good a refuge as any." Every nerve in her body throbbed with the memory of the station's bunkhouse, the clatter of chains, the suffocating stench of fear. Yet she had pledged her life to these women, and when June whimpered, "I can't go on," Miriam pressed a cool hand to her friend's brow. "You'll go on," she said fiercely, "because if you don't, none of us will." And Calla had heard enough. She had no family, no promise of tomorrow, but she carried in her breast a duty born of a season spent cooking for young troopers who looked to her for comfort in the desert's vast emptiness. She would not abandon these 2 souls now. Thaddeus noticed figures emerging from the shadow of a mesquite grove some 30 yards from the porch. He lifted the lantern higher, its glow falling on a trio of women. Gaunt, resolute, their clothes torn and stained, bearing a child between them like a fragile treasure. The little girl's eyelids fluttered as she lay cradled in Calla's arms. A silvery strand of hair caught the lantern light, and a streak of dried blood painted her dress in dark tendrils. Thaddeus's grip tightened on the handle. Every memory he'd locked away rattled in his chest. Fear flickered in his heart. Fear of the unknown. Fear of inviting menace onto his land. But compassion, too, took root, pushing aside the rusted gears of his grief. The tallest woman raised a blood-bruised wrist, as if to shield the child from the lantern's glare. "Please," she said, voice husky as dust. "We need shelter. They're coming." From his pocket, Thaddeus produced the last shell from his father's Spencer rifle, a token to seal the moment. He offered it to Calla without speaking the click of metal on wood, loud in the hush. Calla exchanged a glance with Miriam, who bit her lip before stepping forward to take the shell. With trembling fingers, Calla nodded once sharply and lifted the child into her arms. Thaddeus turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving the door wide, its threshold a silent covenant of safety. Behind him, the desert sighed, and in the distance, call of coyotes heralded the hunt that would soon erupt under the indigo sky. And though none of them knew it yet, the spark of that single sacrificial act of opening a battered heart and a creaking door would ignite a blaze of vengeance, justice, and redemption that no frontier law could ever contain. Thaddeus Cain woke before dawn. The morning after he had opened his cabin doors to fugitives, his heart still hammering, as though it refused to believe the reprieve of night had come. Outside, the desert was cobalt and silent, broken only by the low whistle of a distant coyote. Inside, the 3 women and 4 children slept in a ragged semicircle around the hearth, their breathing shallow against the hush. Thaddeus brushed a calloused hand over his cheek, half expecting to find Ellie's laughter lurking in the dust motes of lamplight, and instead found only the harsh reality that he was a man, pulled back into the world by ghosts he had nursed too long. He rose, padded across the rough floorboards to the countertop, and filled a kettle with cold water from the cistern. The wood stove, cold since last night, creaked as he raked embers to one side. It was the first time in 15 years that his days began with the task of cooking breakfast for more than himself. He built the fire slowly, each strike of steel on flint echoing hollowly in the tiny cabin. When a blue flame flickered beneath the kettle's belly, he set out cracked tin plates and spoons for the women. He found 3 eggs in the root cellar and spun an old frying pan over the coals. The smell of cooking stirred the fugitives from their uneasy sleep. Calla was the first to open her eyes, rubbing at the bruise on her forehead where she had been struck by the station manager's riding crop. Miriam followed, propping herself upright with trembling hands. June, pale and weak, remained still for a moment, before rolling onto her side and peering at the fire. The children, Ellie, Samuel, Josiah, and little Ruth, stirred after them, blinking in the warm glow. Thaddeus slid the eggs into the pan, their edges curling gold. He ladled water into tin cups and set steaming bowls of grits on the table. Then he stood back, arms crossed against his chest, and watched the 4 women and 4 children divide the meager meal. No one spoke until Calla laid a hand on his forearm. "Thank you," she said quietly, voice raw. "For this. For sharing." Thaddeus inclined his head eyes on the small girl who sat closest to him. Ellie's hair lay tangled across her dress, its red-brown strands a perfect match for the wildflowers that once crowned his daughter's curls. At the sight of the child's face, joy and fear racked his insides in equal measure. She glanced up, shy as a fawn, but did not look away. A bond hung in the space between them that required no words. After breakfast, Thaddeus fetched water from the trough outside, and as he returned, Calla fell into step beside him. The air was brisk, carrying the promise of a thunderstorm beyond the western mesa. The wind tugged at their clothes as they stood by the water barrel. "Who are you truly?" he asked. "Why did that girl call me on a name she couldn't know?" Calla's gaze drifted to the rising sun. She set her jaw and met his eyes steadily. "That girl is your blood," she said. "Ellie. My daughter." Thaddeus's breath stuttered. His hands shook, and he felt around him the weight of 15 years of grudge and grief, each one demanding to be reckoned with. "You're saying," he began, voice cracking like dry wood, "that she's my daughter, that you carried her in your womb?" Calla nodded, lips pressed thin. 16 years ago at Fort Bliss," she said. "We shared a dance after the cookhouse band finished playing. You told me you'd be back on leave next spring. I believed you. But the next thing I knew, you were gone, and I was sold." The shock that coursed through him was so fierce that he stumbled back, nearly slipping in the mud around the trough. Memories rushed unbidden, a wide-open tent, the scent of pine and tobacco. His uniform dusted with flour from Calla's apron as they swung together under lantern light. He had thought she was part of the carnival, a bright spark in a somber world. He had never taken her seriously, and she had loved him enough to bear his child. The enormity of it threatened to crush him. He closed his eyes and bowed his head. "Why now?" he whispered. "Why bring her here?" Calla's eyes glistened. "Because Sheriff Hale learned the truth. You've always known he controls the station. He followed us back from Tucson when we found a way out. He'll turn the whole region into his personal market if he can. He hunts us because we know too much, and because Ellie could name you by sight or blood." Thaddeus felt rage bloom like a desert flower in his chest, a bitter, thorny thing he'd thought had died with Mary and Ellie. He bumped his fist into his palm nails, gouging his skin. "He won't get her," he said, voice low. "But steady. No one will lay a hand on this child." Calla studied his profile, noticing the tremor in his jaw. "I hoped you still had something of the man you once were," she said, voice softer now. "We need more than hope, girl," Thaddeus replied, though his tone betrayed the fear he refused to show. "We need plan." She nodded and drew him back toward the cabin, where the others gathered in a circle. The air in the tiny interior crackled as though charged by unseen wires. Under the lamp's glow, Calla spoke of the station's workings. Miriam chimed in with details of patrol patterns. June, her hand pressed against the ragged bandage on her thigh, spoke in a whisper, recounting the young women she had hidden in the supply shed during the last roundup. The children sat on their heels, eyes wide. Ellie curled into Calla's side. Samuel perched on a footstool, listening. Thaddeus listened too, his rifle stocked his mind, assessing every window and notch in the rough walls. They agreed that they could not stay here long. At least 2 days of rainstorms were forecast, and with the desert floor slick trackers could follow hoof prints like a thread. They needed allies. They needed proof, something to show the settlers of Silverbank that Sheriff Hale was a criminal, not a lawman. But there was little time, and the homestead offered scant resources for such a campaign. That afternoon, the storm they sensed in the wind arrived. Dark clouds gathered in swift procession, blotting out the sun. The first raindrops cracked against the tin roof like gunfire. Thaddeus closed shutters, and buckets appeared at every corner of the cabin to catch the downpour. Lightning forked overhead, illuminating the mesa's silhouette in silver. The fugitives huddled together as thunder shook the timbers. When the worst of it passed, Calla moved to the door and peered out. The ground was churned to mud, every hoof and boot print, a stark invitation to any tracker who chanced by. "They'll come for us tonight," she said. Thaddeus nodded, his mind racing through contingencies. He needed to arm the women. He needed to teach them to shoot the peacemaker and nestle cartridges into their skirts so they could fire without drawing a rifle. And he needed to find a way to get word to the only man who could help Wade McKinley. Wade was the rancher who had once offered Thaddeus a job, a place among men who still believed in hard work and honest pay. Thaddeus had refused, then shackled by his own pride and grief. Now he regretted that pride. He slipped on a wide-brimmed hat and a damp, dust-streaked coat, secured his father's Spencer rifle, and stepped into the soggy twilight. The mud sucked at his boots, but each step felt purposeful. Calla followed, clutching her own revolver, Miriam trailing behind with June's other side. Ellie and Samuel stayed inside where Thaddeus told them to wait by the fireplace with blankets and a pitcher of water. He kissed Ellie's forehead. Her cheek was cool against his lips. She looked up with a solemnity that undid him, as though she had always known he was flesh of her flesh. "Be safe," she whispered. Then, with trembling hands, she helped him button his coat. The ride to McKinley's ranch was harrowed by thunder and slick gullies of mud. Thaddeus guided his horse at a careful walk, each hoofstep a drumbeat. In the curt darkness, ahead, the lights of the ranch house flickered, and he urged the horse forward. McKinley, a broad-shouldered man with a shock of graying hair, opened the door before Thaddeus could knock. He blinked at the rain-streaked coat. "Cain," he said. "I didn't expect you back so soon." Thaddeus steadied himself against the lintel. "Wade." "I need your help," he said. McKinley's eyes narrowed as he swept off Thaddeus's hat, revealing the glint of damp hair plastered to his scalp. With what McKinley asked, stepping aside to let him in. Thaddeus shook his head. "With Hale. He's trafficking women and children. He's building a ring." McKinley's face darkened. He had heard rumors, but never dared to believe them about a man of the law. "Proof," McKinley said. "I need proof." Thaddeus nodded. "I know where they're hiding the indenture records in a vault under the station. If we can get those ledgers, we can ruin him." McKinley folded his arms. The rain rattled on the roof. "It'll take a dozen men to storm a station," he said, voice low, "and a dozen more to ride shotguns afterward." Thaddeus stared at McKinley's ranch parlor, where portraits of old cattle barons hung behind a fine mantel. The wind rattled the panes. "Then we'll ride with a dozen men," he said. "Or fewer. Women and children can serve as witnesses. We'll march into Silverbank, demand justice. If the townsfolk won't answer to the law, we'll deliver frontier justice." McKinley's jaw clenched. He looked past Thaddeus toward the storm-lashed plains. "Give me an hour," he said. "Then, saddle your horse." Thaddeus exhaled, feeling the first true surge of hope since the night he opened his door. He patted McKinley's shoulder. "Thank you," he said. "I won't forget this." By the time he returned to the cabin, the storm had spent itself, leaving the earth gleaming under a full moon. He found the women pacing the floor, anxious for word. Ellie pressed herself into Callah's skirts, while June rested a hand on Miriam's hip. Thaddeus set aside his rifle and held out his hand. "He'll help," he said. "We ride tomorrow at first light." The women exchanged glances, relief and dread warring in their eyes. He knelt before Ellie and brushed a curl from her cheek. "You're safe," he promised. The girl nodded, sleep-heavy and trusting, and slipped her hand into his. In that moment, Thaddeus felt the weight of his ancestors in every line on his palms, the legacy of cavalry and frontier that pulsed through his veins. He rose and lifted the lantern, its warm glow trailing through the cabin like a beacon. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we fight not just for ourselves, but for every soul Hale has branded as commodity." As he crossed the threshold, he paused and looked back. The women stood united by the hearth, and in their faces he saw the vow he had once broken come back to life. The bloodline of his own daughter had given him purpose, and with it, the strength to face the fury of man and storm alike. Tomorrow, they would storm the citadel of injustice. Tonight, they would sleep. And when dawn came, the desert would tremble beneath their resolve. Thaddeus Cain woke to the clang of spurs on his porch planks before the first gray light of dawn had fully stretched its fingers across the desert sky. He rose from the makeshift cot, where he had tried without success to sleep every muscle in his body, still throbbing with the memory of the storm the night before. Through the window he saw 6 figures arrayed across the parched ground, rimmed in silhouette by the rising sun. Sheriff Lucas Hale and 5 of his deputies' rifles, cradled in readiness hats, low, and faces unreadable in shadow. Hale's dark uniform was stained with dust. His badge flashed briefly as he stepped forward at the morning light, catching it like a taunt. Behind him, the red sky still lingered, the final ember of last night's tempest, as if the heavens themselves refused to yield. Cain Hale called voice bearing the clipped authority of a man who believed his law was the only one that held sway. "You've harbored fugitives. I know the 3 women, and that child are on your property. It ends now." The sheriff's gaze drifted to the cabin, where Callah, Miriam, June, and the 4 children Ellie. Samuel Josiah and little Ruth stood pressed against one another in the doorway. Pale faces peered through the woman's skirts, eyes wide but determined. Thaddeus found himself standing behind them, the ache in his ribs pulled taut like a bowstring. He had bandaged the wound Hale had delivered with a single hidden shot the night before. If the bullet had nicked the lung, he would not have survived the ride to McKinley's ranch. Yet here he stood, gun belt buckled firm, with 11 souls behind him, who counted on his strength. Hale's hand hovered at his holster. Hand over the women and the girl. He said, voice low, so only Thaddeus might hear. And I'll let you stagger back into that cabin before I burn it down. Refuse and I'll torch the place. You and your little flock will fry together. Then I'll scare up a few more hangings once the smoke clears. A pregnant silence followed, broken only by the soft whine of sputtering wind. Thaddeus felt the weight of every eye upon him, Callah's steady calm, Miriam's coiled fury, June's feverish fear, and Ellie's fearful trust perched on the threshold like a fledgling bird. Thaddeus's heart thundered in his chest. He had no illusions about the odds, 6 armed men against his battered farmhouse, against 4 women and 4 children. Yet he felt a fire ignite inside him, a furious red spark to meet the sky's own rebellion. He stepped forward, hands unclenching at his sides. "You've got your answer," he said, voice steady, though each word gripped him like a blade. "Not one of them leaves this yard alive without my say-so." Hale's expression did not change. He tipped his hat back on his head, gazing at Thaddeus, as one might scrutinize a rattler coiled in the sand. "Then I give you until sundown to reconsider. After that, you'll see justice the way I mete it out." He signaled his deputies, 5 rifles raising in unison toward the cabin. Hale clicked his tongue. "Move forward." The deputies advanced, boots stirring dust, rifles trained. Callah moved to Thaddeus's side and laid a hand on his forearm, light but steady. "They'll start shooting," she whispered, eyes flicking to the narrow windows where bullets might spit through. Miriam set herself in front of June, shielding her friend with her own body. The children huddled together. Ellie's small hand brushed Thaddeus's coat. "Papa." She whispered the single word, heavy with hope. Thaddeus drew in a slow breath and exhaled, voice low for her alone. "I'll keep you safe, Ellie. I swear it." The deputies halted 10 yards from the porch. Hale stepped forward until only a few boots' lengths of dirt separated him from Thaddeus. He spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt. "So be it," he said. "But know this, Cain, if those women fire a single shot, if any of your children cry out in pain, I will not hesitate. And I will find your price." He raised a hand, a faint signal. "Men, stand down." The deputies let their rifles drop. Hale squared his shoulders. "Talk is cheap," he said. "We'll wait. By sundown, your guests will be in shackles, and if they're not, I'll have to solve this problem by fire." He tipped his hat again and backed away. The deputies followed, filing off like vultures retreating before a desert fire. Hale halted at the edge of the rising road, then turned to issue one final warning. "Enjoy your last calm hour, Cain." With that, he mounted his horse and trotted off, dust spiraling in his wake. Inside the cabin, Thaddeus sank to one wooden chair, drawing Callah, Miriam, and June to him. The children collapsed against their mother's skirts. Thaddeus pressed his hand onto Callah's shoulder. "They'll return," he said. "They always do. And when they come back, they'll bring the fire sticks." He nodded toward the rifle rack in the corner, giving Reyes a handful of cartridges, and one battered Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. "Tonight we prepare. We'll fortify the cabin, stack crates against the windows, and pile feed sacks in the hall to deaden the walls. We'll teach the women to shoot every weapon here and hide what we can in case Hale moves on the homestead. Calla gave a grim smile. We'll fight, she whispered. Miriam's knuckles whitened around the barrel of Thaddeus's rifle. June clutched an oilcloth sack containing her few treasured belongings: bandages, a rusted locket, a scrap of bread. Promise me, June said. Breath quick. Promise you won't let them take me. Or Ellie. Thaddeus pivoted, looked at each woman in turn. Not as long as I draw breath, he said. We survive this together or not at all. All afternoon they worked in silence, punctuated only by the thud of feed sacks against walls, the scrape of chairs repositioned before windows, the snapping of rifle actions, cocked and tested. Ellie sat on the floor by the hearth, practicing hammer-cocking the Colt under June's watchful eye. Samuel and Josiah helped move wooden crates. Little Ruth gathered rocks to wedge under the cabin's joists, trying to shore up weak boards. Thaddeus assisted Calla as she drilled holes in shutters, then hammered in iron staples fit for padlocks. A pale sun drifted overhead, shadows creeping around the cabin's corners like ghost soldiers. Thaddeus glanced outside and saw a thin plume of smoke rising at the mesa's rim, Hale's deputy perhaps keeping them in sight. As the sun sank toward the horizon, a red haze spilled across the sky. It was as though the entire world was ablaze and the cabin lay at its bright, hungry center. Hale did not waste words this time. At precisely 3 hours before sundown, when the desert's heat still hovered like a living thing, 6 riders broke from the scrub and charged toward the ranch. Hale led them, spurs, ringing rifles, leveled the dust of the rising horses curling around their legs like restless spirits. Behind them, 100 yards back, a pack of trackers on horseback cut the silence with low shouts and the crack of whips. Thaddeus emerged onto the small porch rifle resting against his shoulder. Calla and Miriam flanked him. Shotguns gripped tight. June stood behind them, pistol drawn. The children huddled out of sight inside. Hale reined in before a safe distance, the red light of the sky painting his face in cruel tones. You made your last stand. Cain, he said, voice echoing off the surrounding buttes. Step aside. Let me take them. I'll spare your life on my terms. Thaddeus braced his feet, legs braced like the timbers below. You've taken enough lives, he shouted back. You'll take no more. With that, he lifted a hand and shook his head. Hale's jaw twitched. He raised his rifle and aimed. In that split second, the world held its breath. The sun dipped behind a cloud bank, a lantern click in the sky. Hale's finger brushed the trigger. But before the sheriff could squeeze, the world erupted in thunder. A feral volley of rifle fire spilled from behind the cabin. Wade McKinley and his ranch hands had arrived, concealed behind rocky outcroppings. Bullets arched in incandescent trails through the red dusk, slamming into the ground around Hale's men. Startled Hale ducked behind his horse's flank. McKinley's voice carried clear. Drop your guns, Hale! It's over. Hale screamed and lunged for cover behind a juniper tree as McKinley and his 10 cowboys appeared on the ridge rifles trained. Hale spun his rifle back toward the cabin, but McKinley fired a warning shot that chipped bark from the tree. The deputies on horseback scattered, seeking shelter behind dusty creosote bushes. Hale's face twisted in fury as he stood fully exposed, his gun level trembling. Thaddeus heard June cry out and spun to see Miriam staggering, blood swirling across her coverall from a grazing bullet. she fell against Calla, who caught her in her arms. June cradled her mother's head, tears mingling with dirt and fear. Thaddeus's blood roared. He raised his rifle and loosed a shot that shattered Hale's holster strap, sending the sheriff's revolver clattering into the sand. One of the deputies answered with a shot that spanged harmlessly off the porch beam. McKinley's men returned fire in disciplined volleys, and the deputies broke and fled. Hale, outraged and wounded in pride, more than body-charged Thaddeus, with only his fists swinging. They met on the cracked boards of the porch, fists colliding with bone and resolve. Hale's blows rang like hammer strikes, but Thaddeus took each with a growl, his fist finding Hale's jaw in return. The sheriff stumbled sightless for a moment. Thaddeus reeled back, catching Hale off guard, with an uppercut that rocked him on his spurs. Hale crashed to the boards in a tangle of limbs and dust. Thaddeus stood over him, chest heaving. He clenched his fist knuckles white against the grain of the wood. His gaze swept past Hale to the cabin door, where Calla knelt beside Miriam, pressing a blood-stained handkerchief to the wound. June knelt as well, rocking, whispering her mother's name. The children huddled in their blankets, eyes wide. Thaddeus's heart thundered not with rage, but with a solitary desire that seared brighter than any fury. He spoke Hale's name, voice low and measured. "This is where your reign ends. No more deaths, not here, not ever." Hale lifted his head, bruised cheek swollen. Blood and sweat mingled on his uniform. He spat a thick glob of rust red onto the porch planks. "You think you've won?" he rasped. "You haven't seen the last of me." Thaddeus shook his head and holstered his peacemaker. "No," he said. "You'll see your guilt. You'll answer for every mother you sold, every child you trafficked. Today you stopped hiding behind a badge. Today you died, Sheriff." He might have pulled the trigger, if only to make Hale vanish in the desert. But even as the hammer clicked back, Thaddeus hesitated. He remembered what it had done to him before, what the preacher at Silverbank's old chapel had warned: vengeance may fill your hand, but it leaves your soul empty. He stepped back. Hale tried to rise, but McKinley's men hemmed him in, rifles leveled at his chest. Thaddeus turned and crossed the porch to the broken doorframe, heart pounding with exhaustion and triumph, and gathered the children to him. Ellie blinked up at him, trembling, and he bent to kiss her hair. Samuel and Josiah touched his boot, while Ruth hid behind Calla's skirt. He looked across the yard at Hale now, on his knees, hands covered in blood and dirt. Hale's eyes, once ice blue, were rivulets of sorrow and terror. The wind blew a gust of red dust into the air, carrying it away in crimson plumes. Thaddeus felt the sky's color fade as the ember of last light died, leaving twilight in its wake. He signaled McKinley's men to bind Hale's hands. "Tie him," he told McKinley. "Bring him here. Let him face them." Hale struggled, but the cowboys dragged him across the yard to the porch steps. Calla helped Miriam stand, her arm pressed across her side. June leaned against her friend, white-knuckled. They formed a line along the porch's edge, the 4 mothers and 4 children confronting the fallen sheriff. Ellie stood at Thaddeus's left, trembling but brave. Thaddeus stepped beside Hale, the barrel of his rifle resting on his shoulder. "Look at them," he said, voice low. "Do you see what you did?" Hale's gaze found the children, and his entire body trembled. He nodded, tears welling. Thaddeus felt no satisfaction, only the heavy weight of justice finally served. "You traded women and children like cattle," he continued. "You robbed them of childhood families' hope. You profited from pain." And now he paused, turning to the witnesses. "You will look into their eyes and answer to their truth." He gestured to Calla. She stepped forward, voice steady, as she recounted her story, how she had served in a dusty mess hall with salt and sorrow, how Hale had watched her, coveted her, then sold her into debt bondage. Miriam followed her tone, clipped detailing how Hale's deputies had seized her children's future and banished her husband to an early grave. June stepped up last, her voice barely more than a whisper, telling of the fear that never left her bones, the shame that clung like a second skin. Each testimony shattered more of Hale's bravado until he knelt completely, his badge lost in the dust. Finally, Thaddeus addressed Hale himself. "You can beg forgiveness," he said. "But forgiveness is only half a victory. I want you to carry their voices in your head, wherever you ride forever. And I want you banished not by the law you perverted, but by every man and woman who values a child's life above profit." "McKinley, do what must be done." Wade McKinley stepped forward, seized Hale by the collar, and hauled him to his feet. By law of the frontier, McKinley proclaimed, voice echoing into the gathering hush, "You are exiled. Never again shall you hold office, carry a badge, or speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. May the desert be your home, and its loneliness your sentence." McKinley spat at Hale's boots, then turned away. Hale crumpled to his knees, body spent. Thaddeus gathered Ellie in his arms and vaulted down from the porch steps. Beyond them, McKinley's men rode up to stand behind the mothers and children, a silent guard. The sky, once red with threat, now paled to a cool, hopeful blue. The world exhaled. Thaddeus Cain, once a broken man, stood tall at the edge of his homestead. Children clinging to him. Women at his side. Justice done in blood and courage. The night's standoff had ended in more than victory. It had forged a community bound by shared grief and defiance. And as the full moon rose above the mesas, illuminating the scarred earth, Thaddeus vowed silently that from this day on, his home would be a refuge, not a prison. That under his watch, no child would ever again mistake the outlaw's call for the father's embrace. The first pale fingers of dawn had barely crept over Gunsmoke Ridge when the ragged assembly gathered on the wind-swept plain ranch hands, from McKinley's outfit townsfolk, from Silverbank, still bleary-eyed at the summons, and above all, the mothers and children, for whom this morning carried more weight than any preacher's sermon. Thaddeus Cain, his ribs still tender beneath a crudely stitched bandage, stood at the center of it all, leaning on the rail of his battered Spencer rifle. Beside him, Callum, Miriam, and June, each bearing fresh bruises and scars, earned in last night's firefight, lined up with their children. Behind them, faces turned toward the low dais that had been erected from overturned feed crates and planks salvaged from the homestead's barn. A hush fell over the crowd as Wade McKinley stepped forward, his broad-brimmed hat in hand. He tapped the lectern twice with the brim of his Stetson, his voice carrying across the still chilled air. "Friends of Silverbank, today we dispense frontier justice." He gestured toward Sheriff Lucas Hale, who knelt on the bare dirt in the center of the makeshift platform, his badge torn from his chest and his wrists bound with rawhide. The assembled townsfolk muttered at the sight, a sheriff brought low by the very law he had corrupted. Last night, this man drew a bead on Thaddeus Cain's daughter, shot at mothers who stood between him and their children. He terrorized our county, sold women and children into bondage, and used our law as his weapon. The crowd fell silent again. On the edge of the throng, farmers clutched their pitchforks, cowhands trusted to their Winchester rifles, all eyes fixed on the fallen lawman. Miriam rose from her seat, swaying slightly as she stepped onto the dais. "I was sold to him as payment for my husband's debts," she said, voice quavering, but loud enough for all to hear. "My little boy was torn from my arms. I begged for mercy, he gave me chains. He pretended to uphold justice while bartering in human lives." June followed, cradling the bandaged side where the station manager's whip had split her flesh. "I thought I could endure it all," she said, eyes brimming with tears that did not fall, "until he turned his cruelty on the weak. He made me watch my sisters broken before me." A murmur ran through the crowd. The wind whipped sand at Hale's knees. He did not look away. Finally, Calla stepped forward, her cavalry-cooked posture still straight and unwavering. She laid a hand on Thaddeus's shoulder, as if to anchor herself. "I knew him once before he donned the badge," she said, head held high. "He was a man you might have trusted. I loved him until I discovered he loved only power. He betrayed every oath he ever took." She drew a deep breath. "We could not bring him to the station without another massacre. Instead, we bring him here before you. Let the people decide his fate." Thaddeus stepped up beside Hale, placing a steadying hand on the sheriff's shoulder, an act of mercy, or perhaps final humiliation. Hale flinched, but did not resist. "Lucas Hale Thaddeus," said, voice deep and resonant in the cool morning air. "What say you to these charges?" Hale's proud shoulders slumped. He raised bloodshot eyes to the vigilantes arrayed before him, the very men and women whose respect he had abused and whose trust he had shattered. The hush stretched until only the faint creak of a plank underfoot disturbed it. Then, in a voice as hollow as the bottom of a dry well, Hale whispered, "I have no defense." Wade McKinley lifted his hat again. "Then let the people of Silverbank vote, whether he walks free, faces exile, or answers for his crimes in the field of honor." He turned to the crowd, raising his voice. "All in favor of banishment, exile from these lands, and this territory, never to bear arms or hold office again, raise your hand." Rough hands shot upward. Cowhands, merchants, blacksmiths, miners, laborers, a sea of palms. McKinley then called for the second option, a duel of pistols at 20 paces. Only a handful of reluctant hands rose. The third option, execution by a single firing squad volley. None dared lift a finger, so the verdict stood. Sheriff Lucas Hale was exiled. A clerk from McKinley's ranch stepped forward and scribed the decree onto a swatch of parchment baked dry by the early sun. Thaddeus read each word aloud. "Let it be known that Lucas Hale, former sheriff of Silverbank County, is banished henceforth from all lands under this jurisdiction. Let him wander as he may, but never again shall he bear witness to our justice or terrorize our people." Thaddeus folded the paper, tucked it into Hale's hand, then turned and staggered down from the dais. The mothers and children descended with him. Each woman looped an arm through Thaddeus's Calla on his left, Miriam and June on his right, forming a chain of defiance. Behind them, McKinley's men untied Hale. His knees buckled as he rose, eyes fixed on the hearth of Cain's homestead, where smoke curled from the chimney, a symbol of hearth and home he had once threatened to raise. Thaddeus guided the three women and their children toward the track leading out of the gorge, toward a life neither shackles nor bullets could ever define. As they passed Hale, the exiled sheriff dropped to one knee and offered a broken nod, a gesture of grudging respect or final apology. None could say. Then he turned his back and trudged away, his silhouette swallowed by the golden haze of morning. With the crisis resolved, the crowd dispersed some. Loitered to offer congratulations. Some saluted Thaddeus with deep nods. Others lingered to see if Sanctuary Ridge, as Wade McKinley, christened the Cain homestead, would indeed become what it promised. By noon, a team of carpenters arrived under McKinley's hire to reinforce the cabins and build bunks for mothers and children who had nowhere else to turn. A makeshift schoolhouse was raised beside the original cabin. A communal dining hall took shape over the ridge to catch the breezes that tamed the summer heat. Farmers who once whispered Cain's name in fearful tones now rode across the arroyo to bring supplies. Sacks of flour, barrels of salted pork, bolts of canvas for tents. Blacksmiths repaired harnesses. Physicians tended June's wound and cleaned the splinter that had struck Miriam's arm, while local preachers offered prayers of forgiveness under a hickory arbor. Thaddeus watched it all from his porch, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his mouth, as Ellie, her hair now brushed and braided, tugged at his coat. She led him to a battered wood table set under a cottonwood tree, where a platter of freshly baked biscuits awaited. As he broke a warm piece in half and passed one to her, he felt a surge of gratitude he had believed lost to the years of grief. The laughter of the children sang. Josiah Ruth echoed across the clearing, mingling with the low hum of saws and hammers. Calla poured coffee from a steaming pot. Miriam handed out slices of cured meat, while June cradled her locket, close eyes shining with new purpose. Thaddeus settled back in his chair, traced the initials Borisitsi carved into the tabletop, and closed his eyes against the midday sun. 15 years of solitude and despair had been washed away by gunfire and solidarity. He felt Mary's gentle presence in the sway of the cottonwood branches, and Ellie's bright spirit in the children's songs lifting into the sky. And as the ridge settled into its new life, one not of rumor and fear, but of refuge and hope. Thaddeus Cain, once a broken man haunted by ghosts, let the first full laugh of his renewed heart rip through the air. In the valley below, the wind carried that peal of joy across the desert, a promise that Sanctuary Ridge would stand long after any outlaw or lawman had been reduced to dust.